wrestling has always followed the norms and trends of American society. As our country changes, so does wrestling. However, every historic change needs to have had a first. Here are some of pro wrestling's firsts for its black competitors that we may have forgotten about. Tom Jones, the man that integrated pro wrestling in Louisiana. Tom Jones began wrestling in 1965. He worked mostly in Leroy McGuirk's territory, covering Oklahoma, Louisiana, and parts of Texas. It didn't take long for him to be a part of history. Like most forms of entertainment in America in the 1960s, pro wrestling was segregated. Not just its audiences, but in a lot of states, the matches themselves. In a lot of southern and Midwest states, a black and a white wrestler could not compete against each other. This led to many matchups being repeated over and over again from territory to territory. And a black wrestler certainly couldn't be the babyface to a white wrestler's heel. But in 1966, that all started to change. One night, in Shreveport, Louisiana, Tom Jones wrestled Cowboy Bill Watts as a babyface, the first black man to wrestle a white man in the state of Louisiana. The Big Cat, Ernie Ladd, pro wrestling's first black booker. A top star in every territory he appeared in, the Big Cat began to slow down his in-ring career in the early 80s. His arrival to Bill Watts' Mid-South Wrestling in 1979 saw him wrestle occasionally and managing stars such as the Wild Samoans, Afa. But he would also be given the opportunity to book smaller shows for the territory, a first in pro wrestling. This opportunity would not be taken lightly by Ladd and saw him build the character Junkyard Dog, who would become one of the top stars the territory ever had. Ernie Ladd would be inducted into the WCW Hall of Fame in 1994 and the WWF Hall of Fame in 1995. Sandy Parker, the first black woman to win a major women's championship. Sandy Parker grew up a massive wrestling fan in the 1950s and 60s. By the late 60s, she was ready to begin her training. She would initially train with Lou Klein in Windsor, Ontario. Afterwards, she moved on to Fabulous Moolah's camp in South Carolina. She would butt heads with Moolah over the percentage of her money that Moolah was taking. She left and would move on to Mildred Burke's troupe. Sandy would continue touring through the segregated US and Canada, but would find her place in Japan. She would join All Japan's women's wrestling and formed a dominant tag team with Betty Nicoli, winning the WWWA World Tag Team titles 4 times. But her defining moment came in May of 1973, when she ended the reign of Miyoko Hoshino to become the WWWA World Champion, making her the first black woman to win a women's world championship. She would continue to wrestle until 1986, but would stay active in the women's wrestling scene until the early 2000s. In 2004, she was inducted into the Cauliflower Alley Club. Bearcat Wright, the first black world champion. Bearcat transitioned from boxing to wrestling in the mid-1950s. He quickly became a very popular babyface with black and white audiences all over the country. A fighter for equality, Wright once served a suspension from the Indiana State Athletic Commission after announcing to a full crowd that he would no longer wrestle in Indiana until wrestling became desegregated in the state. By 1963, he'd settled in Los Angeles-based World Wrestling Associates, the WWA. On August 23rd of that year, he would defeat Classy Freddie Blassie to become the WWA World Heavyweight Champion, becoming the first black man to be recognized as a world champion in wrestling. He would hold the championship for 115 days until he was stripped for missing a title defense. Unfortunately, this reign was erased from the books in 1968 when the WWA rejoined the National Wrestling Alliance. In 2017, Wright was inducted into the WWE Hall of Fame as a legacy inductee. Today, black pro wrestlers, both male and female, have been able to conquer the wrestling world, and some have conquered other worlds entirely. We owe a huge debt of gratitude to these pioneers for the conviction, courage, and ability to overcome a world designed to keep them in a box. Thank you.